Fox host Laura Ingraham is reaching back all the way into the 1950s in order to make a case that it's not easy access to guns that have caused the increase in mass shootings over the last few decades, like the one most recently in Uvalde, Texas, although there have been quite a few reported shootings since then, because in the United States, we have a mass shooting nearly every day. So, but she's going to go on to say it doesn't have anything to do with the guns. No. It's actually the pot.
Well, the New York Times had originally reported that Ramos smoked pot. Then, mysteriously, the reference was missing from the online editions. Now, why is that? Respected medical studies for years now have demonstrated that pot use, especially among teens, can trigger psychosis and increase the chance that a young person will develop violent behaviors. Former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson has written extensively on this subject. A 2012 paper in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence examining a federal survey of more than 9,000 adolescents found that marijuana use was associated with a doubling of domestic violence in the U.S. My question tonight is, why isn't there a national conversation happening right now about this? Why aren't reporters doing more to demand information on the potential drug use, in this case and others, both illicit drugs and prescription drugs? Whenever there is a societal, cultural, familial, and spiritual deficit, bad things are going to rush in to fill it. Guns, gangs, drugs, then there will be harm to others or self-harm. And until we're honest about all of this, young people will continue to be pawns in a political game.
Now, I love how she talks about, until we're honest about this. Well, I mean, you could start. I mean, that'd be great if you could actually start being honest yourself. Now, look, again, there's so much here in this segment that was wrong, just absolutely wrong. I mean, where do I even start? Where do I start? Oh, yeah. Let's start with the fact that marijuana does not cause mass shootings. Marijuana doesn't cause mass shootings. Violent video games or movies do not cause mass shootings. So now, look, let's get into the argument. Where does she get this from? So now, she cites several things in this, and one is a conservative group, obviously. The other is more interesting. Her main source is an anti-vax COVID truther named Alex Berenson. So now, Berenson was a journalist. He actually used to work for the New York Times, then became an author. He had written a book back in 2019 where he claimed that it was marijuana that caused violent episodes of psychosis and therefore was causing mass violence. So his theory, and again, theory, not actually true, that people would smoke pot and then, or whatever, ingest it, what have you, have violent psychosis and then go on to do acts of violence. So now that book, unfortunately, received very favorable coverage on outlets like CNBC, The New Yorker, Mother Jones, The Marshall Project, and of course he ended up writing op-eds about his findings, and again, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. So this is a person, now of course, after COVID, because he had come out to criticize vaccines, mainly he is now just on Fox News. But there was a time where his theories, again, theories, and his ideas were put all over mainstream media. So now, again, my problem here is the findings, okay? How he arrived at these findings. So now, for one, he cited a report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine on a link between marijuana and psychosis. Now, he claimed from reading that report in his book that, Well, these organizations, they declared the issue settled. There's an obvious link. And so if you smoke the pots, you're going to get violent. And that's just a fact. In reality, the National Academy's reports was very nuanced, very careful. It actually cautioned that marijuana and marijuana addictions linked to psychosis is multidirectional or maybe multidirectional and very complex. Basically, marijuana may not cause psychosis, that there's something else that may cause both psychosis and pot use, or that causation could go the other way. Basically, we're not exactly sure and we need to study more. That was the conclusion here. Another possibility they cited is psychotic disorders might end up leading to marijuana use as a way, of course, to self-medicate, because here in this country, in America, we don't have health care. We don't have mental health care. So easier to self-medicate, right? In fact, the report noted that in certain societies, the incidences of schizophrenia have remained stable for the past 50 years, despite the introduction of cannabis into those settings. So introducing more cannabis has actually not increased the levels of this specific psychosis. Now, does he mention any of the caveats? Does he mention any of the nuance here? No, not at all. Does he mention any of the positives? No. What he did is cherry pick data only showing the negatives of cannabis use in order to fit his narrative, and then went with it. And unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream media also went with it as well. So now he also overstates any evidence for a link between pot and psychosis and misrepresents other books and studies that had been done on this. Now, again, the reality is far more nuanced. In fact, in a 2018 study published in Nature in Neuroscience, it's actually, it suggested that it's more likely that schizophrenia, again, leads to marijuana use, potentially to cope or self-medicate. The National Academies also analyzed studies on how marijuana affects symptoms of psychotic disorders. There was some evidence that a history of marijuana use might actually improve cognitive performance for those with psychotic disorders. However, of course, that same study ultimately concluded that the evidence was merely limited or moderate, meaning, of course, we need more study. We need more evidence. We need more data. We need to do more of this. We need to learn more about these effects. Okay? So now, it's not settled. And we need more research. Now, that said, does marijuana have benefits? Obviously. Cannabis has a lot of benefits. Is it a cure-all? Absolutely not. There is no panacea. There is no magic cure for everything. But it does help. Now, does it also have risks? Yeah, there are also risks. There are risks to anything, right? Should it be illegal? Hell no. Should we regulate it and tax it? Yes. Should we also ensure that big corporations do not have a monopoly on this and be able to push out smaller growers? No, we should make sure that they do not have those monopolies. And so now on Bernson, again, his analysis on pot and psychosis, very incomplete, lots of cherry-picked data, but also uses a lot of anecdotes of people who may have smoked marijuana and then went to do some heinous crime at some other point in their lives. Well, that's not really evidence. Anecdotal evidence is not evidence. Basically, I think he's like the first to pioneer the Nicki Minaj's "my cousin's friend's balls swelled up due to the vaccine" argument. Well, I know somebody, or I saw somebody, or read a story once where somebody who had smoked pot at one time then ended up chopping up his grandma, and therefore we must conclude that it was the marijuana that made him chop up grandma. No, that's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Now, again, he's a COVID truther who had argued against the vaccine using very flawed analysis. So that makes him, of course, a perfect fit for Fox News and Laura Ingraham to be cited. And again, because he had been featured on mainstream media, because he had been a New York Times journalist at one point in his life, that lended him an air of credibility. That Fox News, of course, is like, ooh, yeah, let's jump into that. Now, look, no mass shootings mass shootings are not because of the legalization of marijuana or even the existence of it. No, the common thread that underlines every mass shooting in the United States is the easy access to weaponry. That's it. And look, we can look at every other country that has the same issues that we have. We have mentally ill people here. There are mentally ill people all over the world. There are people that have addictions all over the world. There are single-parent households all over the world. It's insane that we're even using, or that they're even using those arguments. There are violent video games and violent movies that are seen or played all over the world. And yet these other countries can go without mass shootings for years, sometimes decades. But in the United States, we have a mass shooting nearly every single day. Why the difference? Why the massive difference? The guns. It's the guns. Again, other countries either have incredibly stringent gun laws, or they have that and a different culture, because gun culture here in the United States is much different, I think, than the rest of the world. I mean, even in other countries that have high rates of gun ownership, they do not treat them as if they are toys. They treat them as they are, deadly weapons. They're not toys. They're not penis enhancement tools. They're not things for you to cosplay soldier. They're weapons capable and created for killing, for death. You want to create your entire persona around something that creates death, there is something wrong with you. Now, thankfully, the vast majority of gun owners don't actually think that way about their weapons. They actually do have respect. And I'll make my own anecdotes, right? And maybe it's not representative, but I think when you look at the polls, look at the vast majority of gun owners that are for reasonable things like background checks, increased background checks, federal, closing the loopholes, all that stuff. They're in favor of it. Massive majority of Americans, but 90% roughly of Americans support common sense gun regulation. So there's a small minority of people who do, have these very extreme views on their guns. And it is not in step with the vast majority of American citizens. Now, you want to talk about something that's also out of step? Congress way out of step. And that's sort of different because, yes, while it's related to the group, the very small minority of people who are completely obsessed with their weapons and have that culture, again, these politicians obviously pander to those people for votes, but they also pander to the gun lobby, the gun manufacturers, the NRA, places like that give them checks. Lots and lots of checks, lots and lots of money. Mitt Romney, for example, through his career, received over $13 million. In fact, every politician that you hear, mainly Republicans, but again, there's some Democrats as well, like Henry Cuellar, that have received millions of dollars from the gun lobby. And of course, they're out there opposing even the most sensible gun laws. Just the tiniest amount of regulation. We can't even get a background check in this country, while Canada just pretty much froze the sale of all handguns. So think about that. That's the reasons that we can't move forward with this, even though there's massive support. Now, the other thing to consider as well, we're the only country in the world, in the modern developed world, that doesn't even have universal health care. And that includes mental health care. Somehow, we lack that in the wealthiest country in the world. Well, again, it goes back to the issue of Congress. It goes back to the issue of money in politics. And so, yes, all of that stuff is related, unfortunately. So, nonetheless, in order to get you to not talk about these issues, especially money in politics, but yes, the guns as well, here's Fox News throwing out the squirrels. Oh, it's the drugs. It's the drugs. It's the mental health. Even though we're not going to actually do anything about mental health. It's the violent video games. It's the pot. All that. Squirrel, squirrel, squirrel. To try to distract you from actually doing anything. To distract you from the real cause. So at the end of the day, these politicians and these media figures can continue to make gobs of cash off their corruption.